important to the United States as actual citizens of the states. So she says the Supreme Court will give Trump the win on this one if it goes and throw out the whole thing. Much to discuss tonight. So attorney Byron Henry is joining us now to answer some of the questions I or you may have. Byron, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
Do you think that is a plausible scenario, that if it does go to the Supreme Court, the Supremes will throw it out?
Well, first and foremost, the standing argument, which is what that judge was talking about, is whether or not the states of Minnesota and Washington have the legal right to file a lawsuit on behalf of other people. And there are some instances where you can file a lawsuit on behalf of others. But the first thing that struck me in reading the opinion this evening, it was about a 30-page opinion, which was extraordinary in and of itself because it was basically argued 48 hours ago, is that it's extremely broad on standing. Where the Supreme Court is very strict on standing, this court was very broad on standing, just talking about indirect interests and things such as that, like the judge talked about. So I do think that's a hurdle. Whether or not they would throw it out on standing, remember the Supreme Court is divided on a lot of these issues 4-4 on a kind of a conservative versus liberal, for lack of a better descriptor, side of this. And so it's not clear that they would throw it out, but certainly the first thing those states have to do in challenging the executive order is establish standing. And remember, these aren't the individual citizens that are affected by the ban from Washington or Minnesota suing. This is Washington and Minnesota suing for all of them, yes, nationwide. And so yes, I do think there's at least a legitimate question whether the Supreme Court would think that while the Washington may have standing to sue on behalf of one professor who has a job and is trying to teach there, or a researcher, I find it hard to imagine that the Supreme Court would allow two states to sue on behalf of everyone in every state in the United States based on people that are not legal permanent residents of this country, non-citizens coming to this country. So I think that is a stretch.
Well, the issue of legal standing is one issue, but I also thought, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this might go to the Supreme Court to see if it's constitutional. Does that play as well, or are they two separate issues?
Well, it's two separate issues, and let me just say first and foremost that this is not a decision on the merits, like whether this is constitutional or not. This is a very preliminary stage. It's not only the temporary restraining order stage, which is the very first step in one of these lawsuits, it's a stay of a temporary restraining order, which is a very temporary, high burden for the government to meet once they've lost before the lower court judge. They have to basically prove that they're going to win the case, and if the court doesn't allow the travel ban to go into effect right now, that the government or its citizens are going to face irreparable, imminent, like right now, harm. And other than just a general injury about national security and that the president has the right to enforce the immigration laws, the government really didn't have specific evidence of imminent harm that's going to occur over the next few weeks while this court sorts through the rest of the case, the lower court. So I think that it's not the right position, I don't believe, for the court, Supreme Court or any other court, to be declaring whether it's constitutional on the merits. It's a little early for that, but I do suspect that the Ninth Circuit was rather broad in who it assigned constitutional rights to. It basically was handing out constitutional rights to people with visas that were not in this country, people that had never been to this country, refugees. I guess it would apply to asylum seekers. So I do believe, like their standing analysis, they were a little bit liberal, small L there, liberal with who has constitutional rights to be heard and to come to this country. And I suspect if it does work its way all the way up through the court system, that will be narrowed significantly as the case goes forward.
Let's flesh that out a little bit, because that was a conversation I was having in the afternoon with my colleague John Williams on our show with his show with the listeners, and we were talking to Dave Schultz, who's a professor, and he said the Constitution, who has constitutional rights, doesn't necessarily come into play here, because the Constitution governs what we are allowed to do, what the United States government is or is not allowed to do. So in our Constitution, it says we are not allowed to be biased against someone because of their religion. So he says the constitutionality issue governs us, and that applies to all humans. It's how we are allowed to treat all humans. Is that correct?
Well, actually, he may be speaking about the religion clauses of the exercise of of freedom of religion, free exercise, and establishment of religion in the First Amendment. But what he might be considering is also the statute. Congress has two statutes out there that people are fighting over. One is a statute that says when giving visas to people, you can't discriminate against them based on their national origin or their religion. That's two of the criteria. But then later on, the Congress also gives the president the unfettered discretion to deny any class of aliens entry into the country for a specific period of time if the president deems it necessary to protect national security. Now, you're talking about constitutional rights with respect to discrimination based on religion. The problem with that is that if they're not here and they've never been here, then the constitutional rights, so to speak, would not apply to them. You know, they're not green. If they're not green card holders, or they're not actually in this country, present in the country, whether lawfully or unlawfully, most court decisions say they don't have constitutional rights. And this opinion seems to at least imply that people overseas that are not here and are not green card holders have a constitutional right to a process as to how and when they can be denied entry. And that seems to fly in the face of Congress's delegation of absolute discretion to the executive to determine who can come into the country and who can't. So there is going to be a clash here between the court saying that certain people abroad have constitutional rights and Congress saying, no, the president gets to determine who gets to enter the country if they're not lawful permanent residents. And so let's don't get confused on this, because there is some confusion out there, including in the opinion itself, where they're conflating green card holders, which is a separate class that President Trump has said this does not apply to green card holders, and then everybody else trying to get into the country.
That's fascinating. So I guess the constitutionality of it is still in play, because that was the confusion this afternoon. Who does the Constitution cover? And the way we were explained this afternoon was the Constitution covers us, but it covers us as to how we can govern the rest of the world, how we are allowed to govern, and we are never allowed to discriminate anybody based on religion. But you're saying that even that is still in play and a little nebulous under our Constitution.
It's absolutely in play. I mean, the fact that we can never discriminate based on religion is way overbroad constitutionally. First of all, Congress has absolute discretion over immigration in the Constitution. So constitutionally, Congress can say who can and can't come to this country, period. Secondly, they've delegated to the president a very broad discretion on implementing the immigration law. So basically, the Supreme Court has said in numerous cases that the political branches, the president and Congress, have almost unbridled discretion. The courts will check them, but they give high, heavy deference to the political branches on immigration. So you have that underlying this. But the real question is the due process rights, the Fifth Amendment due process rights of people that are trying to get into this country. There is very little, if any, authority for the proposition that non-citizens or non-permanent residents in this country that are here lawfully can come into this country and have any rights to any due process whatsoever to get into the country if they're not here. So if someone's in a war zone in Syria and they try to apply for a visa and the visa is denied, they don't have a right, of course, to a hearing before a judge on why their visa was denied. They don't get to have a lawyer and a full hearing. Denial by the executive branch is considered the due process. So that is the tension that we're working with here, whether or not people that are not citizens and don't have vested rights here like a green card can basically invoke the Constitution from Iran. Can they invoke our Constitution from Syria? Can they invoke our Constitution from Yemen and force the executive to lay out this huge procedure on how he's going to deal with allowing them entry to the country? I believe the answer to that question ultimately when we get to the merits will be no. That the executive simply can say, I'm not letting people in from this country for 90 days, and if they haven't already been here or they're not here now, I don't think they're going to have any constitutional rights.
You know, the only good thing about this big brouhaha is that we are learning. We Americans are learning so much about our laws, about our Constitution, and it's forcing conversations like this where, look, I took constitutional law in high school and college. We did mock Congress, all of that stuff, but I am relearning all of this, and it is fascinating. Attorney Byron Henry, I'm so grateful you took the time to come on the show, and I do hope you'll come back, sir. We have lots of questions.
I suspect there'll be a lot more procedures to discuss, and I'd be happy to be on any time. Thank you for
You got it. Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to have a lot of go-to guys because we have lots of new questions popping up every day.